Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. Picture this. You're a fairly successful drummer. You play small gigs with a number of bands, and on occasion, you get called into the studio to serve as a session drummer. That's exactly what you did a couple of weeks ago, playing alongside Tommy Quickly, and serving as producer for that session was the one and only George Martin, the same man who produces for the Beatles. That was pretty cool, but you did your job, and it's once again time to gig and wait for that next phone call. It's now June 3rd, 1964. You eat a nice, heavy lunch, then take a little lie down, ready for a nap, when suddenly, your phone rings. It's EMI Studios. Excellent, more work. But wait, what was that? Rehearse for who? For the Beatles? Right now? You rush over to the studio. You arrive, and waiting for you are John, Paul, and George. You are told that Ringo is in the hospital. For 2 hours, you run through the Beatles' current live repertoire. It goes pretty well, but you're not sure what to expect. The three Beatles, George Martin, and band manager Brian Epstein all step aside to chat. You wait, and just a few minutes later, they all re-enter the studio. Pack your bags, Brian says. You are leaving for Denmark tomorrow. Until Ringo is healthy enough to return, you will be the one drumming for the Beatles. Your name is Jimmy Nicol, and your life has just been turned upside down. But this is only the beginning. Today, we will be covering the entirety of the Beatles' 1964 World Tour. A tour unlike any before. Without being too negative, here's one thing I'll say. Not one piece of Beatles media has come anywhere close to conveying the madness, the insanity, the unrelenting chaos the Beatles were subjected to on a day-to-day basis, nor the actions they undertook to endure this, which, as you could imagine, entailed shit tons of drugs and unimaginable amounts of physical activity. Well, I'm here to tell you everything as it really occurred. But first, a word from our sponsor. Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform. Whatever your goals may be, Squarespace can help you accomplish them. From the jump, I was impressed by their design tools. We're talking templates, color palettes, visual design effects, all of which make it incredibly easy to create a stylish website in just a few clicks. And if you're like me and want to continue to make it your own, you can do just that with flexible drag and drop editing, custom pictures, and just about everything else you could want. If you're running a business, Squarespace allows you to address whatever needs you may have, such as their Acuity scheduling software, which makes booking and managing appointments stress-free. Looking to sell content? Whether it's classes, blogs, videos, or memberships, Squarespace allows you to paywall your work, set fees or subscription prices, and forget all the rest. Head to squarespace.com/makingofthebeatles for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, use offer code MAKINGOFTHEBEATLES to save 10% off your first purchase of website or domain. Back to the video. Let's quickly rewind a bit to check on poor Ringo. It all began just the day before, as Ringo came into the studio with the others to record some final bits and pieces for a hard day's night. At that point, he didn't feel great, but figured it was just a cold. The next morning, he woke up feeling much worse, but along with the rest of the Beatles, had an obligatory photo shoot with the Saturday Evening Post. He forced himself up out of bed and made his way to Prospect Studios, where the photo shoot was to take place. But once there, he quickly went downhill. He could barely muster a smile. He was running a high fever, and his throat was just about swollen shut. At one point, he became dizzy and fell to his knees. He was first brought back to his apartment, but as his condition worsened, he was finally driven to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with tonsillitis and pharyngitis. It became clear that he would not be able to join the Beatles in Denmark the following day. Thus, we circle back. Jimmy Nicol was brought in to rehearse, and then was given the job of replacing Ringo. But it was not without debate. Brian Epstein was dead set on moving ahead, while John and Paul were hesitant, but ultimately agreed to go along and begin touring with Jimmy. But George, out of a legitimate loyalty to Ringo and the Beatles, nearly refused. "I was very against that," he said. "I didn't want to do the tour without Ringo. It's stupid. The Beatles were, always will be, the four fabs. And so three fabs and a not-so-fab is not the Beatles. At least, that's how I felt. When I think back, it's hard to imagine how we were treated or bullied by Brian Epstein and George Martin into accepting that situation that we had to go. We should have been more forceful and said, no, we're not doing it. It was also no help to Jimmy Nichols' life to be king for a day.
Yeah, I really despised the way we couldn't ever make a decision for ourselves. It was always like, no, sorry.
But the decision was made. On the morning of June 4th, the Beatles were driven to the airport, where they would depart for Copenhagen, Denmark. It was business as usual. The Beatles were greeted at the airport by thousands of screaming fans. They were then escorted by Danish police to the Royal Hotel. Joining the Beatles was Derek Taylor, future press officer for Apple Corps, and at this point, acting as a general media representative for the band, as well as ghostwriting articles for George and a book for Brian. Derek is a wordsmith, and many of the recollections he shares are a candid insight to the goings-on in the band's day-to-day life. Perfect example. On arrival at the Royal Hotel, a telegraph was given to the Beatles. We'll let Derek recount the rest. Child dying in this family. 2 days to live. Please call. Child is Mary Sue. Paul said casually. That's the second telegram. The first said 4 days to live. I suggested we call the number given. Waste of time, said Paul. It was probably a con, and even if it wasn't, what could they do? Then he shrugged and said, call, why not? I'll talk to them, if you like. So I called. There were screams at the other end when I explained who I was. I shouted over the bedlam. Is Mary Sue still alive? Are we in time? This is Mary Sue speaking, said a whiny teenager voice. Please don't blame Mom. I made her do it. I just had to speak to Paul. Oh, Paul, are you there? I just have to talk to him now. Please don't let him be mad at me. Paul took the phone from me. He handled the conversation coolly. Now, Mary Sue, you know you shouldn't go around telling lies and frightening people like that. When it was over, he looked at me, his eyes round and solemn. See? After sneaking in a couple hours of rehearsal time, the Beatles would perform that night. But frankly, Jimmy was not on Ringo's level, not to mention the clear lack of chemistry and experience with the others, which they would later recall in 1969.
Oh, yeah, but those shows.
There's no sense of tone.
Those tours, we just miss out half the song.
That one with Jimmy Nichols.
Yeah, well,
First time we'd ever had this new drummer because Ringo was sick. And he was sitting up on this roster, but he was just eyeing up all the women. We just, 1, 2!
And we
1, 2! And he just...
The next day, they flew out to Amsterdam, where they would make a television appearance. But the real fun would occur after hours, as the Beatles would make their way to Amsterdam's famous red light district, a night that John would remember for quite some time.
I mean, when we hit town, we hit it, you know, we're not pissing about. But, you know, there's photographs of me, God knows, they're crawling about in Amsterdam on my knees, coming out of whorehouses and things like that, and people saying, good morning, John, and all that. And the police escorting me to the places and things like that. You know, because they never wanted a big scandal.
The following morning would bring only more spectacle as the Beatles embarked on a canal tour of the city, a publicized event that unsurprisingly got out of hand, with an approximated 30,000 fans lining the banks, some even diving into the water. Thankfully, for the Beatles at least, there were also thousands of police officers on duty. During the float, the Beatles spotted a student wearing a distinct coat. They loved it. What do you do if you're the Beatles? I'll let George tell you. We sent Mal to find out where he got it from. Mal jumped off or swam off the boat, and about 3 hours later, turned up at our hotel with the cloak, which he'd bought from the guy. Apparently, it was this very jacket that would later inspire their looks for the cover of Help. The Beatles had 2 shows scheduled for the day, and in between, they were expected to attend a civil reception in their honor. In a very similar turn of events to the far more disastrous 1966 incident in the Philippines, the Beatles, intentionally or not, snubbed the event. Picking back up with Derek Taylor, While the three Beatles and Jimmy Nicol tried to get some sleep, Neil and I went out into the late afternoon sunshine for a walk. We bathed in sunshine and anonymity, blissfully unaware of the consternation prevailing at a local restaurant, where the boys were awaited at a Civic reception. The Beatles knew nothing about this arrangement. The Civic leaders were understanding about the mix-up, but I felt very bad about the whole affair. Aware that the Beatles were not to blame, I nevertheless expected them to show some sympathy for the fans and officials they had, however innocently, disappointed. To my suburban middle-class mind, their indifference seemed callous. Yet, as I well knew by now, they could never have survived if they'd let every special event rule their lives and worry away their very limited leisure time. Which is true, very, very true, and is something they would all remark on later in life. George would say, it never seemed to enter their minds that every moment of every day, of every week, of every month, we were meeting millions of people. Everywhere we went, it was someone. This one, those two, police chief, Lord Mayor, Yogi Bear, his granny and his daughters with their selected friends. God, it was awful. And in 1970, John would basically say the same.
But it just built up. It built up. The bigger we got, the more unreality we had to face, the more we were expected to do, until when you didn't sort of shake hands with the mayor's wife, she started abusing you and screaming or saying, how dare they, and there's one of Derek's stories where we were asleep after the session, in the hotel somewhere in America, and the mayor's wife comes and says, get them up, I want to meet them, And Derek saying, I'm not going to wake them up. And she starts saying, you get them up, I'll tell the press. And it was always that. They were always threatening what they would tell the press about us, the bad publicity if we didn't see their bloody daughter and with their braces on her teeth. And it was always the police chief's daughter and the Lord Mayor's daughter, all the most obnoxious kids, because they got the most obnoxious parents, we were forced to see all the time. And we had these people thrust on us,
The madness would only continue. The next day, the Beatles would fly back to London, though it was only to touch down and to connect to another flight, this time on the way to Hong Kong. And this trip would require several stops. 4, in fact, for refueling. And at each and every one of these stops, a quote-unquote reception was planned. What you'll begin to pick up on here is a distinct disconnect between the Beatles and their handlers, who frankly treated the boys like products. For those like Brian and Derek, this was about fame, world domination, the Beatles phenomenon. But for the Beatles themselves, it was exhausting, and more so, degrading. Back to Derek Taylor. Paul summoned me to his seat. Do you know anything about these so-called welcomes? A little, I admitted. Well, we're not doing anything. We're knackered. You'd better make sure everyone know. I was sure that all that was required was a wave and maybe the acceptance of a bunch of flowers. It didn't sound too onerous for me. Roadie Neil Aspinall then stepped up in defense of his longtime friends. You're gonna have a telex sent ahead to every stop, saying we won't be doing a bloody thing. Bollocks to what they want. They don't owe a Swiss bunch of arseholes anything. Regardless, at each and every airport, fans turned up in the thousands. In Zurich, the Beatles refused to leave the plane. In Beirut, police had to use firefighting foam to keep fans off the runway. When they arrived at Karachi at 2 a.m., Paul figured it might be late enough to sneak off and take a stroll through the airport. He thought, incorrectly, he was mobbed and had to be quickly escorted back. After a peaceful stop at Calcutta, the Beatles flew to Bangkok, where finally they would present themselves to the crowd, signing autographs and accepting armfuls of flowers and gifts. Mercifully, their next stop was their destination, Hong Kong. But despite the mobbings, their frequent refusals to greet fans, the Beatles actually had a great time with the journey. And there's a reason why. George tells the story. The best flight I remember was that one to Hong Kong. It took several hours and I remember them saying, "Return to your seats, because we're approaching Hong Kong." And I thought, we can't be there already. We'd been sitting on the floor drinking and taking preludins for about 30 hours, and it seemed like a 10-minute flight. On all those flights, we were still on uppers, and that's what helped us get through, because we'd drink a whiskey and coke with anyone, even if he was the devil, and charm the pants off him. It was during this last leg of the flight that the following interview was filmed.
John, have you ever been interviewed 34,000 feet above sea level before?
No, definitely not.
How are you enjoying the trip? Not bad, it's a bit long, you know, but they're looking after us well.
Would this be the longest trip you've made?
I don't know. Yes, it is, I think.
This will be.
What
beard?
Oh!
We're being assailed by
No,
the beard's growing. It's John, I think. Good old carefree John. Just put it down here and pretend to ignore him. You're all right, though. He keeps doing this. Always good for a gag is John, you know. What do you expect to do in Hong Kong? Well, Bob.
The Beatles were booked in a hotel suite that had been vacated just hours before by the president of Indonesia, who had left his mistress behind. She was still sitting there when the Beatles arrived. By the way, did I mention that John's Aunt Mimi had been there the whole time, including their drugged-out airplane ride? "What sort of hotel is this?" she said, leaving strange women lying around from the previous guest. Surprise, surprise, another reception had been planned without the Beatles' consent. This time, a beauty pageant. Small problem though, Paul and George were dead asleep, and Jimmy, being unrecognizable, was out playing tourist. Thankfully, John was still wired enough to attend, though after much persuasion from Derek. To prepare for the excitement, the two got drunk out of their minds and made the walk down to the reception. Here's Derek. John was invited up onto the platform and immediately launched into an incredibly fast and complex speech in which the only intelligible word was definitely. He used the word so often that I feared he would be rumbled as, quote, out of his head, but he wasn't. It seemed that he could not give offense, no matter what. He smiled, kissed contestants on the cheek, and kept on rolling with definitely, stretching it outrageously to become more and more Liverpudlian. If the Duke of Edinburgh had turned up saying definitely every other word, there would definitely have been trouble. But the Beatles, being funsters, cards, mischievous boys, could get away with it. Miss Hong Kong having at last been chosen, we took ourselves off, and John crawled up to his room, laughing all the way, now totally exhausted. On June 9th, they would perform in the Kowloon region of Hong Kong, a name that may sound familiar to you, as it sits directly next to the infamous Kowloon walled city, though at this time, it was just beginning to really grow. After all the hubbub, the Beatles played before a small crowd, by their standards at least, in large part due to the high admission price, about a week's earnings in Hong Kong. With that over, it was now time to embark to Sydney, Australia. They would receive no rest on the plane ride over. Quite the opposite, in fact. "None of us slept on the flight to Australia," Derek would write. "We flew on into the night, over the maddened sea and through the storm-crazed sky." The plane touched down in Sydney. The rain was torrential. Yet even with it, the 5,000 fans, drenched to the bone, could be heard screaming. Initially, the Beatles refused to leave the plane, but were persuaded out, and wielding umbrellas, were loaded into the back of a truck.
We had these capes that were disasters when we hit Australia, and the rain hit them and the dye started coming out.
And they put the Beatles on the back of this, flatback truck, right, with umbrellas, right, and they were wearing these capes, right. I was okay, I was in the cab. The driver wouldn't go any faster. I kept saying, go faster, it's pouring down. And he'd say, these kids have been waiting here, for 24 hours to see these guys. Got to the hotel and everybody was blue because the dye had soaked off these coats that were made in Hong Kong.
From this point on, though, things would begin to get just a little better. The Sydney press were good sports, treating the Beatles like human beings.
Coming on the open cut in that truck round because the kids have been waiting all night and they appreciate it.
Well, they deserved it, didn't they, waiting all night?
Yeah, hope you're wearing drip-dry clothes, were you?
No, we thought it was going to be sunny.
And thousands of miles away, Ringo was finally discharged from the hospital. Contrary to popular belief, Ringo did not have his tonsils removed at this point. That would come later. Not long after his discharge, Ringo would hop on a plane to Australia.
This is San Francisco International Airport. We are here, as are about several hundred teenagers, for we think the same reason. They tell us something called a Ringo star is coming to San Francisco. This, to my understanding, is a form of insect. Police and airport officials have been urging people not to come out here all day long. I genuinely didn't want to, but the powers that be have a sense of humor not like mine, obviously. We wondered if all of them really were here for this purpose, so we decided to ask. Why are you here? Heard it. That's the reason they're all here.
He's so cute!
The Beatles conducted press, and after another long day, went to bed. No one expected the sight that would greet them the next day. The Beatles had thought America was the peak of insanity, but boy, were they wrong. In the early afternoon, after a short flight, the Beatles' motorcade would depart, headed toward Adelaide. And as it did, they were greeted by an unbelievable sight. Some 250,000 people lining the highway. The Beatles, well accustomed to the sight of thousands, were nonetheless struck dumb by the size of the crowd. Wherever we go, anywhere in the world, John would say, this reception which Adelaide has given us will stick in our memories. And he was correct in saying so.
That was like heroes' welcome, that was the kind of thing where you'd go to the town hall and they'd all be in the centre. I think we quite enjoyed all that stuff.
Yeah, shocked and stunned. Just happy that it was, we're still popular down here too. Nice feeling. Everybody's saying, there's more people here than came to see the Queen. Well, I should think so. She didn't have any hit records.
It's funny, but there was more people came to see us there than anywhere. I mean, it looked like, I think the whole of Australia was there.
They would play several shows today, on the 12th, as well as the next. With Ringo quite literally flying over the sea, on his way from San Francisco, the Beatles' June 13th performances in Adelaide would be the very last for drummer Jimmy Nicol. On the 14th, Ringo finally made it to the other Beatles. They showered him with gifts they had purchased in Hong Kong. The enthusiastic welcoming was exactly what Ringo needed, as despite himself, he had become incredibly insecure in the short time away from the others. He couldn't help but be upset that they had left without him.
Because I wasn't well and they'd taken Jimmy Nichols and I thought they didn't love me anymore, and all that stuff went through my head.
And a small part of him feared that they would replace him. The inverse of which presented itself in Jimmy Nicol. In just 10 days' time, Jimmy had been given a taste of a phenomenon like had never before been seen. He had been lifted from obscurity, and not just into the limelight, but into a reality that was almost indescribable. And then, just as suddenly, he was once again, in the eyes of Beatles fans at least, a nobody. There had been a very small hope in Jimmy's head, a pipe dream, that he may just end up as Ringo's replacement. Maybe Ringo wouldn't get better, or maybe the Beatles would prefer his drumming. None of this came true. For Jimmy, the dream was over. And how did he handle all of this? The answer, unfortunately, is not well. Standing in for Ringo was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Until then, I was quite happy earning 30 or 40 pounds a week. After the headlines died, I began dying too. At 8 a.m. on the morning of June 15th, Jimmy Nicol left the hotel. There was no goodbye to the Beatles, as they had had a long night out without him and were all sleeping. Accompanied by Brian Epstein, he was driven to the airport, where he was given a bonus of £500, as well as a gold watch with the engraving, to Jimmy, with appreciation and gratitude. And that was it. Ringo got right back to drumming, and the Beatles kept on playing. On the 18th, they left Melbourne and returned to Sydney, playing at Sydney Stadium. It was also Paul's 22nd birthday, which meant, of course, a blowout party at their hotel. There were special guests as well, 17 girls, or hopefully grown women, though that may be wishful thinking, who had won a newspaper competition deemed Why I Would Like to Be a Guest at a Beatles birthday party. I'd be curious to know the judging criteria. On June 21st, the Beatles would fly to Wellington, New Zealand, but not before just a bit more lunacy. Early in the morning, a Liverpudlian man named Peter Roberts scaled the Beatles hotel via its drain pipes.
John, there was a story told about a fellow who knocked on your window on the 8th floor outside. Would you like to tell us that story at the Sheraton Hotel in Sydney the night you were packing to come here?
Yeah, well, we were just sort of each shoving our rags into a case, dirty rags. And I heard a knock on the window, and I thought, it must be one of the others messing around or something. I didn't take any notice of it. He kept on knocking. So I went out there, and there was this lad who looked just like a Liverpool lad, and I knew before he opened his mouth where he was from, because I thought nobody else would be climbing up 8 floors, And I opened the window, and this lad just walks in. Peter, I've forgotten his other name. And he says, hello, dear. We said, hello, dear. And he told us how he climbed up, and he'd emigrated 6 months ago. gave him a drink because he deserved one after that climb, you know. I took him round to see the others because he climbed into my room or the sitting room we had, but the others were still packing. And they were quite amazed. They thought I was joking when I told them.
New Zealand was beautiful, but the complete dearth of nightlife brought the Beatles no pleasure. When we were flying into New Zealand, it looked like England, George said. But in those days, we were looking for some action, and there was absolutely nothing happening. We were in the hotel room, sitting around eating fish and chips with peas and watching television. And suddenly, at about 9 o'clock at night, the channels all closed down. So we threw our dinners at the TV.
Like being dragged through a crowd by a fellow 3 times your size.
Well, I didn't see anybody 17'9", did you?
He was a great big security corps, fellas.
Aye, I don't think he was 17'9", though, was he?
17'9", how tall are you?
Quick calculation. No, you should have worked that out, shouldn't you?
Well, I did.
Third of 17'9". All right, come on. Yeah.
The rest of their stint didn't go any better. Now, it wasn't like New Zealand was Antarctica or anything, but the attitudes were different, and nothing seemed to go smoothly. First off, the Beatles were denied police escort, with the Auckland Chief Constable saying, "We provide such escorts only for royalty and other important visitors." He'd follow this up by addressing the Beatles manager directly. "We didn't want them here, and I don't know why you brought them."
Were you knocked about at all yourself?
Car, you know, but there was plenty of knocking about going out. There was only about 2 coppers there, you know.
The sound at the venue was piss poor, and the sound operator himself didn't seem to really know what he was doing. To cap this all off, the band touring with the Beatles, fellow NIMS managed group, Sounds Incorporated, was caught in a bad spot when a woman their drummer had brought to his room suffered a mental health crisis and attempted to, On the 25th, the Beatles would experience their first bit of pleasantry in New Zealand. At a dreaded reception of all places, it began with a scene straight out of a comedy skit, as the mayor repeatedly tried to quiet down the crowd so he could speak.
Hold it! Hold it, please! 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 Ladies and gentlemen, and boys and girls, and Beatlemaniacs. Hold it a minute, will you, boys? Hold it. Hold it, boys and girls.
The mayor then went on to basically diss the chief constable and the police force as a whole due to the hostility they displayed toward the Beatles.
I want you to join me in doing something that Auckland should do. On your behalf, I want to thank the police and the Auckland City Council Traffic Department. We put this show on for you people, for your entertainment by the Maori County Concert Party, led by Abby Walker.
John would recall the following. "It was one of the quickest and most pleasant receptions we've ever been to. The Lord Mayor was very nice and said, 'I wouldn't have blamed you if you hadn't come, with all the fuss they've been making round here about how much it's costing.'" This moment of positivity was short-lived. On the 26th, the Beatles departed from Auckland, headed to Dunedin. But plans were delayed when the Beatles received a bomb threat, specifically that a, quote, germ bomb had been placed on board the airplane. The plane was cleared, but boarding proved difficult, as again, with the constable in opposition of the Beatles, had assigned only 3 officers to oversee the process. Roadies Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall had to take on the role of enforcer, as unsurprisingly, the Beatles were mobbed on their way out, with John having a clump of his hair ripped out and Paul receiving a non-insignificant scratch on his face. The Beatles arrived in Dunedin. During their ride over to the hotel, a 13-year-old girl threw herself in front of the car, bouncing off and landing on the road. To their credit, the Beatles and their team did check on her, even escorting her to the hotel. But at said hotel, there lay in wait teenage boys, hiding in a closet with hopes of snipping a bit of the Beatles' hair in order to impress their girlfriends, they later said. Thankfully, before any tragic scissor-related accidents could occur, they were chased off and down a fire escape. The Beatles would perform 2 shows in Dunedin, and on June 28th would return to the far friendlier Australia. The Beatles' world tour would officially end on June 30th after a performance at the Festival Hall in Brisbane.
All my love.
it would be a long journey home. On July 2nd, they touched down at Heathrow Airport, London. The Beatles' touring time in America receives far more attention than their other stops, and as we'll get into in a later video, for good reason. But as we've discovered today, there was nowhere in the world safe for the Beatles. The Beatles will always receive credit for their music, but really, they should receive more praise for their resiliency, for their ability to withstand and survive the insanity that surrounded them 24/7. And ladies and gentlemen, we are just getting started. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, and if you would like to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing. These videos are released every 2 weeks. But do you want to watch the next video right now? You can do so by joining my Patreon for only $1 a month. The next video in the timeline has already been made, and if you would like to watch it, you can find it in the top right corner or in the description. Fair warning though, this was one of the first videos I made, so the voiceover is a bit rough, and there are a few glaring factual errors, such as mixing up the timeline with Jimmy Nicol. Still, it's there if you want it. Once again, thank you so much. Until next time.